Welcome to Come Study With Me, a Come Follow Me podcast by young adults for young adults, brought to you by BYU's Why Religion. Welcome to Come Study With Me. My name's Ellis. I'm your host, and we're going to jump right in today. So we'll go ahead and introduce our guests, Quinn and Halli. Do you want to tell us a little bit about you?
Yeah, of course. I'm Quinn Mitchell. I'm from Richland, Washington. I'm a second-year psychology major here at BYU, and I just recently returned from my mission.
I'm Halli Hales. I'm from Roosevelt, Utah, and I'm also here at BYU studying accounting.
Awesome. Well, I'm stoked to have you guys on today. Brother Patterson, would you like to tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yes, I live in Springville, Utah with my family. I am the director of the Utah Valley Institute, connected to and close to UVU, that university up north, right, from BYU. And seminary teacher at heart, and just excited to be with you today.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, let's get started. Let's jump right into it. Brother Patterson, do you want to give us a little bit of context for these sections that we're going over?
Absolutely. Today we'll be in Doctrine and Covenants section 2 and kind of the second half of Joseph Smith history. Most people get through the first vision, but don't get beyond that. And we get to spend a little time in that today. This section of the scriptures is an appearance, a visitation, if you will, of the angel Moroni to Joseph Smith. Joseph had the first vision about 3 years ago. And so Joseph's 17 years old, but frankly, not a lot has happened since the first vision. And that's going to cause a lot of what we'll read about today. And for Joseph to maybe reach out to the heavens, wondering a little bit of what am I supposed to be doing? And so the angel moved 3 times in one night and then once again the next day. And then section 2 is just a small extract into that interview that he had with the angel Moroni. We get to just kind of peer into a little small piece of that.
Awesome. Let's jump right in. I like how you said that not a lot has happened since the first vision, because not a lot has. And even in the last section, Joseph says he knew that he needed to continue as he was until further directed. And so we've got 3 years of Joseph just continuing. And let's jump right into verse 28. Now, verse 28 is quite a long verse, but I want to point out just a little bit of this middle section. You know, Joseph talks about these last 3 years, and he said, I was left to all kinds of temptations and mingling with all kinds of society. I frequently fell into many foolish errors and displayed the weakness of youth and the foibles of human nature, which I'm sorry to say led me into diverse temptations. You know, he goes on to say that, you need not suppose me guilty of any great or malignant sins, but I was guilty of levity and sometimes associated with jovial company. Why do you guys think Joseph includes this in his history?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk on that. I've actually had a lot of thoughts on this as I was reading Joseph Smith history. I think, I was thinking, like, why Joseph? Why did God choose Joseph? And I think what I've seen the most is that he's so humble, and he's consistently humble, and he's really honest about why he doesn't think he's completely qualified for the job that God's asked him to do, and why he's kind of surprised that God picked him, but he's glad to do that anyways. And I think this verse really shows his humility, because he's willing to lay a lot of his flaws in this kind of crucial part of his life, as a teenager, right after this huge event and right before some more huge events. And he's telling us, like, look, I still had a lot of flaws, and I'm not perfect. But then he goes on to tell us the miracles God did with him.
This feels like a journal entry of mine from probably not too long ago, where, I don't know, you try and do your best, but obviously you're going to fall, and you're in the world and you try not to be of it, but it grabs you or you grab it, and you just end up doing things you shouldn't. But ultimately, it's okay, because Jesus Christ can heal us, can help us repent and be forgiven. And I, reading this verse, felt a lot of solace and comfort, knowing that somebody who did so much, like Joseph Smith, is just, at one point, was just a boy or a man like I am, who is subject to diverse temptations and surrounded by, just regular people who maybe lead him the right way or the wrong way. And so it felt extremely relatable to me, especially while I was reading it.
Yeah, it's kind of cool to think in all caps at the bottom of my scriptures that said Joseph was human. And it's not unique that we believe that our leaders are human, but I think it's important for us to remember that they're not perfect. And I like that, like Halli said, this shows Joseph's humility. That even though, we revere him as a prophet of God because he was, and he did a lot for us and a lot to bring this church, to bring Jesus Christ Church back to the earth in its fullness, but he was still human, and God still used somebody that wasn't perfect. Like Quinn said, I think that's the coolest thing, that it gives us a lot of hope.
Well, I think like a lot of, return missionaries, you've just done something really spectacular, something really deeply spiritual, something really significant. And then you come off your mission and you're going, okay, now what am I supposed to be doing? I think of Joseph Smith at 14. He has this, just marvelous vision. And what's the result of that marvelous vision? He's back to clearing fields. He's back to clearing fields. He's back to digging wells. He's back to school like you and those that are listening. You're just going about the mundane things of life. And what's my purpose? What am I supposed to be doing? Because Joseph was told not to do anything. He was told he was forbidden to join any religion. And so I'm guessing Joseph's sitting here going, what am I supposed to do? And because of what I experienced, now some people just don't like me. People that were once my friends are now no longer my friends. And so he's hanging out with the wrong crowd because he just wants to belong. And so maybe, he's just searching for belonging. And so he's maybe hanging out with some people that maybe he normally wouldn't hang out with. And that's getting him into a little bit of trouble.
I actually love that we're talking about this, because this is one thing that, at least recording this podcast, I have come to really hope is that, as missionaries come home, a lot of times you have that lack of purpose that Brother Patterson was talking about. There's that little bit of the, wait, what do I do now? Like, I just went back to the same thing that I was doing before. And I'm like, I feel different, but I'm doing the same things. And it's a really weird kind of in-between phase. I hope that, us talking about this helps us to, or helps everyone to understand that, this is okay. Sometimes there is a waiting phase and it's uncomfortable, but there's a lot of sacred in those waiting spaces. And that's something that, coming home, I really struggled coming off of my mission for a long time. I knew where I was going. I had long-term goals, but again, you feel that same little void. It feels like a big void.
Well, and for Joseph, 3 years would have felt like a very big void.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about the exact same thing. And I think sometimes we get in this rut, like, I was supposed to learn this lesson at this part of my life, and now I'm in a new part of my life, but I can't find how to learn the same lesson that I already learned in this part of my life. And I think, especially for return missionaries, something I've learned after I got home is that the same lessons I learned as a missionary, I'm not needing to learn right now in college. Like, I'm in a different part of my life and I already learned those. And so I can take that knowledge and know that I gained that. And I think that's same for Joseph. He doesn't need to learn the same things he learned from the first vision when he's in this waiting phase afterwards. There are different things that God wanted him to learn in that waiting phase. And it's okay that they're different. It doesn't mean he's doing something wrong because they're different. It's just his growth. And it's part of that growth process for him.
Yeah. And then Moroni shows up. Like, Joseph keeps going and he's trying, and he hits a point where he's praying and he's like, I don't know where I stand. Because for Joseph, the heavens probably felt silent for a little bit. And I think that is, at least for me, coming off of a mission, the heavens felt silent for a chunk of time. It wasn't just back in and then you have the spiritual high still, because you're coming back to life, and that is okay. And Joseph felt the same. We'll dive into what Moroni says.
I just wanted to say something about verse 29, where he says, I often felt condemned for my weakness and imperfections. I betook myself to prayer and supplication to Almighty God for forgiveness of all my sins and follies. And I just was thinking, how must he have felt having failed after seeing God the Father and Jesus Christ the Son face to face, and knowing that they're real with such a full knowledge, such a powerful experience, and then, like he said, falling in temptation afterward and seeking forgiveness. I just thought, I feel some type of way if I, after taking the sacrament, fail in a certain way that same day, because that feels like such an important spiritual experience every week. And being not far removed from it and messing up makes me feel like, wow, how stupid can I get, right? When will I learn? Or What do I need to see to finally just stay on the right path and keep myself there? And so I was trying to empathize with Joseph there and how he must have been feeling praying. But something I really liked was that he said, "For I had full confidence in obtaining a divine manifestation as I previously had one." So he wasn't really experiencing any of that. I don't know if you guys have felt this before, but sometimes you feel too bad to pray. It's obviously a temptation from Satan, right? He doesn't want us to pray when we're in that spot. But he had full confidence that even having been so high as having had the first vision and falling so low as of whatever he did, he had faith that God was able to forgive him and do it in a miraculous way like he had seen before.
I too have that underlined in my scriptures, the full confidence, because I think that gives, another aspect of faith. That faith isn't just like crossing your fingers and hoping. It's confidence that God will answer those prayers.
And it seems like that confidence comes from previous experience. He's had a previous experience, a pretty significant experience with God that only would build his confidence that the heavens could be open, that God does answer prayers if we seek him out in faith. And I think each of us have had those experiences that if we can reflect back on, will give us confidence to approach God when we do feel like the heavens are closed, or I'm not getting answers to my prayers. Maybe I do feel condemned. Maybe I do have lots of doubts about my future, as Joseph must have had. But because of our past experiences, that can build our faith. And so part of, I think, confidence in God is remembering the experiences that we've had. We remember how merciful God has been to us in the past, and we project that into a future where we see God is a merciful being and will continue to be merciful towards us.
I really like that. And I think, he's having this confidence while he is repenting and reaching out to God. And that's something I feel like has been a significant distinction in my life, is to learn what feelings come from God and what feelings don't come from God, because, he is feeling pretty weighed down by his sins. But the key point is that he feels confidence. And so, that's when we know that it is coming from God, because when God's talking to us and telling us, kind of that chastisement, telling us we need to straighten up, we feel an excitement and a confidence in our ability to change. And I think that's really key. His confidence in God, and probably that underlying confidence in himself that comes from that confidence in God. And if he was feeling more like he does when he talks in the first vision, just weighed down and all this evil, when we feel negative feelings and incapable of making changes, that's when we know it's not God, because God will always instill that confidence in us, in him, in ourselves, and that will make us excited to make the changes we need to.
I love that thought too, that it's hopeful. It's like, okay, I can do this. I think sometimes too, with that confidence to change, God tells us things repeatedly and gives us a little bit of encouragement. And in this time, Moroni told Joseph these things 4 times. Moroni told Joseph that God has a work for him to do, that your name's going to be had for good and evil among all nations. There's a book in a hill nearby. This is a 17-year-old kid he's talking to. He's like, yeah, there's a book. You need to go walk the mile and go find it. And Joseph did, which is, I think, the coolest thing. He's like, you're going to translate this book. And then he quotes Malachi, Isaiah, Acts, Joel, and he goes on to quote more of these scriptures. And that's where we get the Malachi verses. So in Doctrine and Covenants section 2, let's dive right into kind of what this means. There's only 3 verses. So let's each, Halli, Brother Patterson, and Quinn, would you each take one of those verses and we'll just read them?
Behold, I will reveal unto you the priesthood by the hand of Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord.
He shall plant in the hearts of the children the promises made to the fathers, and the hearts of the children shall turn to their fathers.
And if it were not,
the children shall turn to their fathers.
And if it were not so, the whole earth would be utterly wasted at his coming.
Okay, let's dive into them. Because for me, this is Malachi. These are Bible verses. Now, granted, these are a little different than the verses in Malachi. But what do these mean? What stands out to you guys in these verses?
I think it's one more time that God's saying, remember. When we're having the hearts of the children, the promises made to the fathers are being planted in our hearts. That's when we remember. And I think that's another thing that gives us that confidence. God has already made and kept these promises once or twice or thousands of times throughout, all of our ancestors and the people we read about in the scriptures. And so we can trust him. We can trust him to keep those promises that he's making to us because he's already kept them so many times in people's lives that are different, but so similar to ours.
So something that stood out, something that I thought was really cool last night when I was studying this, I dove into the differences between the verses in Malachi and the verses that Moroni told Joseph Smith. And one of the key differences in these verses is he says, I will reveal unto you the priesthood by the hand of Elijah. When in Malachi, it just says, behold, I will send you Elijah. Why do you guys think that difference, that Moroni included that?
Yeah, the Bible makes it really clear that Elijah would come before the second coming, but the Bible doesn't make it really clear why he's coming. And so Moroni doesn't seem to be correcting the record. He seems to simply be clarifying or bringing emphasis or helping Joseph understand the purpose of Elijah coming. Our Jewish brothers and sisters, every Passover set a place for Elijah, an empty chair, a plate at the table, an open door, anticipating. They believe in this prophecy that they believe in this prophecy that Elijah would come. We understand because of Moroni and because of the ongoing restoration, the purpose of Elijah, why he was coming, the keys of the sealing power that he would restore. And so to our friends, we would say, well, yeah, he's already walked through the door. He's sat at the chair. He's partaken of the feast. And we know that took place in the Kirtland Temple on April 3rd, 1836. Elijah came and fulfilled that prophecy and restored those keys of the sealing.
The little thought with that too, the day that Elijah came to the Kirtland Temple would have been the day of Passover when the Jews were setting that place for him at their table.
Yeah, you have to love the Lord's timing. He has great timing, right? To see that he just aligns the heavens. That's why he's the master teacher of all things.
It's perfect for sure. Let's see. I love that if Elijah doesn't come, if the sealing power isn't here, the earth would be wasted. And why do you guys think that is? Like, why do you guys think the earth would be wasted if we didn't have the sealing?
What's the point? If we can't be, Elder Gong has his talk, Happy and Forever, and he talks about, like, if we can't be happy forever, what's the point? Or if we're happy, but we can't be happy forever. I don't know if I said the same one twice, but anyways, you know what I'm saying. If we can't be happy and we can't be forever, then there's really no point because, we want to be with our families and we want to have the opportunity to receive all the joy that God has and that he wants to give to us. And if we didn't have the sealing power, like, none of that would be there. And there really wouldn't be as much of a point because we couldn't grow to become like God in the same way that we know that we can with the sealing power.
I love two statements from our prophet, President Nelson. He said, the purpose of the earth is to exalt family. But President Nelson, he said, the purpose of the earth is to exalt families. And then he said something very similar. He said, the earth was created and this church was restored so that families could be formed, sealed, and exalted eternally. So he's placing the family at the very center of the plan of salvation. The earth was formed and organized so that a family could be created. The fall was so that family could grow, and a Savior and a Redeemer was promised, so that family could be exalted. And so if families aren't formed and sealed, then what a waste. The creation, the fall, and even, dare we say, the atonement of Jesus Christ, but a waste if the whole purpose is not fulfilled. To exalt families, to exalt your family.
This is interesting. Next in Joseph Smith history, after, Joseph talks about how Moroni comes back and he visits him again, and then some time passes. And Joseph, in the next part in his history, he goes to where he meets his wife, Emma. And at this point, 4 years have passed since Moroni has come, since he's seen Moroni. And he's been going back to the place where the plates are. He's been going back to the Hill Cumorah every year and being taught by Moroni. But then he comes and he meets Emma. And one thing that stood out to me in these verses is that he talks about, in verse 57, he says, during the time I was thus employed, I was put to board with Mr. Isaac Hale of that place. It was there that I first saw my wife, his daughter, Emma Hale. And on the 18th of January, 1827, we were married while I was yet employed in the service of Mr. Stoll. And I find this interesting because in the verse before, he talks about how Mr. Stoll, Josiah Stoll, had hired him to look for this mine. And because of that, people called him a money digger. Like, his reputation got even worse than it already was. But because he was there working with Mr. Stoll, he was able to meet his wife. And it reminded me of that verse in Ether, that it's Ether 6, verse 8, that talks about the wind did never cease to blow toward the promised land. And that God had him perfectly positioned in this place to meet the people that he needed to, in this case, to meet Emma. And then afterward, he was able to receive the plates. And
also to meet Martin Harris, right?
Mm-hmm.
In verse 61, it talks about how they were really poor and they didn't have any resources, and there was no probability of us being otherwise. Then God intervenes, right, and puts Martin Harris in his path, who then helps him out with $50, right? So, like you said, the wind never did cease to blow. Joseph Smith and Emma in the direction where they needed to be.
Have you guys
seen that in your lives?
This is one of my favorite parts of the gospel, I think, is when we get to a point in our life where we can look back and we see God pulling our little strings and getting everyone and everything lined up to where it needs to go. And I think we see it so much. And like when you look, I know you asked me in my life, I'll get there. But when we look at Joseph, like, he's telling us this like long after. And so he knows it all is going to work out. But like, he probably didn't at that point. You know, he was worried about money and he didn't know who he was going to marry. And he was getting called a money digger and it wasn't all working out. But when he's writing this, he knows now he's going to meet his wife. He knows he's going to meet Martin Harris, who's going to help them financially. And I think in my own life, I've just had time and time again that God has pulled all the little strings in my life to make it work out. You know, I wasn't even planning on coming to BYU. And then on my mission, he pulled some strings and here I am. And then, you know, I had a lot of life circumstances that seemed like, you know, big trials happened and things changed. I ended up leaving my roommates and moving apartments and my whole life fell apart. And then all of a sudden, like, everything is just falling into place. And, you know, I think it's miraculous when we can look back, but it doesn't feel that way in the moment ever, you know? And I think if we can remember in the moments that it feels like everything is so falling apart and we have no clue what's going on and we have no idea how anything is going to work out, that God is at the helm. And if we are just trying our little best, that he'll be pulling his little strings for us and the wind will blow us towards him and towards the people and the places we need to be.
Elder Bednar talks about this a lot. He says, I say he talks about this a lot because he recently came to our stake and gave us this whole like devotional on this, that if you're being a good boy or a good girl, quit worrying about it. It's hard for me to do. But Halli, I love that you said that in the moment, it might feel like it's falling apart. And that's okay because we can't see that bigger picture yet.
And it's probably a lot easier for Elder Bednar to say, don't worry about it, because he's been down the road. He probably did worry about it. He was probably just like you, right? And wondering how his future would work out, how his life would work out. Am I going to get married? Am I going to be able to provide for my family? You know, what does my career look like? How am I going to be a dad? He probably had all the same worries that you're having. And now down the road with eyes to see, it all works out.
I remember going off of that. I remember this day last year where I was really struggling. And, you know, I was just like you said, I didn't know that it was all going to work out at that point. And I remember saying to my mom, I know eventually I'll probably be okay, but I just want to fast forward to that part and I can't imagine how I'm going to get there. I don't see how God's going to work this one out for me. And it actually took way less time than I expected it to take for me to be okay and for God to work it out. And, you know, I thought like, okay, maybe in 5 years I'll be okay. And then suddenly 3 months later, everything worked out. And, you know, now I'm here and I'm so happy and I'm through all those trials that I was facing. And I think back to those days where I thought, you know, I know eventually I'm going to be okay, but I'm not right now. And I'm so grateful for those things that pushed me to where I am now, but I'm also so grateful that God let me be here now. And, it's just like you were saying, Brother Patterson, God works it out every single time. And it's okay if we mess it up a lot of times along the way, he still will work it out every time.
Before I went on my mission, I would think about the future and I'd feel this terrible anxiety. And after strengthening my relationship and faith in Jesus Christ, through all the experiences I had on my mission, I just have this sort of stillness all the time when I think about the future. I really just believe and trust that if I do what the Lord asks, everything will be okay. Maybe not exactly how I expect. And sometimes I think about it and I catch myself thinking about the future and I wonder, and I probably say, like, should I be more nervous about this? Why don't I feel anxious? Why do I feel so calm? And then I remember, well, it's because I just know that the Lord is going to make everything okay.
I love that. I also have a very similar experience to that coming off of my mission, Quinn, that before it was a lot of fear toward the future. And that was something that God taught me as well, that it's in his hands and it's going to be okay. I'm not big enough. Takes the characters to Professor Charles Anthon in New York. And looking into this last night, I learned that Professor Anthon was a professor at Columbia. Like, that's prestigious. It was prestigious then and it's prestigious now. That would be incredibly intimidating. And we have this record here. And I think this kind of goes into a little bit of what we were talking about. Because Martin Harris took these characters to Professor Charles Anthon and he said he ripped up that certificate that he had given Martin Harris. And even though that physical proof that Martin probably wanted wasn't there, the work still continued. We still have the Book of Mormon. We didn't need proof to get it and to have it translated. I've kind of found that in my life, is I have found that I don't need proof to keep going, for God's hand to keep working. Like Halli said, all of a sudden I'm like, wait, I'm here. It's like, this isn't where I was thinking that I was going to be at this time, and it's because of the hand of God. And I just like to invite you guys one more time. Thank you so much for your participation, but I'd like to invite you to share your testimonies.
Yeah, of course. Throughout my whole life, growing up a member of the church, I've always heard about Joseph Smith, learned about him, and wanted to believe he was a prophet. And it's something I took for granted, just that everybody thought he was a prophet when I was a kid. I remember going to elementary school and talking to my friends about Joseph Smith and them being like, who's that, right? Because he was just such a normal part of my life, hearing about him. And as I grew up, you hear more and more things that, people try to make you question his divine calling as a prophet. But the more and more I learn about Joseph Smith, the more sure I am that he was a prophet of God, and that his works in the restoration, everything he did, is exactly what God asked. In all the different fruits that he's given us through the restoration, that God has given us through Joseph Smith. And I feel so blessed that somebody like him, who's imperfect, who is a man, who is subject to temptation, who at first was just a boy, was able to shoulder all of the different afflictions that were given him and persevere and even seal his testimony with his own blood, because he was so sure of what he had seen and heard in his vision, in the first vision. And that makes me feel sure about it too. And I've been able to read the Book of Mormon and pray about it and learn about Joseph Smith and pray about him. And I know that he is a prophet of God and that this is God's restored church.
I also have such a strong testimony of Joseph Smith, and I feel like I really gained a lot of that as I served a mission in New York, in Palmyra, but that wasn't necessarily because I was in those places. I think it's mostly because I learned more about him as a man. And I learned that he wasn't perfect. And I learned that he had fears and struggles just like I did. And I think that has helped me to gain a testimony of him, because he's not the point. Joseph Smith was a way that God did his work on the earth, but he was just a person. And I have a testimony that God called him and used him, But God is the point in that statement, not Joseph Smith. And so, there are questions, there are things I don't understand, and there are ways I know he was not a perfect person. But I also know that I'm not a perfect person. And I know that God used him, and I have a testimony of the way that God used him. And that strengthens my testimony that I know that God will use me. Because I'm just a girl. I'm imperfect, and yet I can do God's work too. And so I know Joseph Smith was a prophet, and I know that prophetic calling was one endowed and made possible by God, by the heavens, by Jesus Christ. I know that it was God's power that was manifest, and he was just a tool on the earth.
I'll add my witness of the prophet to those that have been shared. I love the prophecy of Moroni in these sections that we've been looking at, that Joseph's name should be had for good and evil among all nations, kindreds, and tongues, or that it should be both good and evil spoken of among all people. I was blown away to be in a little village in Guatemala up in the mountains. There was not a single telephone. There was not a single television. We would send our mission statistics, our key indicators, in by telegraph. I mean, that's how remote this area was. It's not I was old. The area was just remote. And yet I would listen to people every day as we'd walk down the streets, even little children that would run up and run past us and say, Jose Smith, and they would pronounce the name of Joseph Smith. I'm thinking, how on earth have these people even heard of the name of some boy that grew up in New York, right? In a small town, not New York City, right? Halli, you served out there. Ellis, you served out there. This was a remote place, and yet they knew the name of Joseph. Now, when they said to us, Jose Smith, they were not saying it in a positive light. And never has it been more true than today that his name would be had and known for good and evil. There's never been a time in the history of the world where more people have praised him to be a prophet than now. And there's never been a time in the history where his name has been also dragged in the mud. That prophecy has certainly been fulfilled. And I just bear my witness that Joseph is a prophet. He saw God. He translated the Book of Mormon. And through Elijah and others, the keys of the priesthood have been restored, that all the families of the earth might be blessed, and that all people might receive the blessings of the restored gospel of Jesus Christ.
Thank you guys for your testimonies, and thank you so much for joining us on Come Study With Me this week. We look forward to having you on next week as well as we study Doctrine and Covenants sections 3 through 5. We'll jump right into it. We'll see you next time. Thanks for joining us on this episode of Come Study With Me. We hope you've loved exploring these Come Follow Me scriptures with us. Please share the show with your friends and family, and remember to leave us a podcast rating. Please share the show with your friends and family, and remember to leave us a podcast rating as it helps promote the show to others. You can go to comestudywithme.byu.edu to get show notes and transcripts. And be sure to follow us on social media on Instagram, Facebook, X, and TikTok at Come Study With Me to get uplifting interactions with content and listeners in your feed. The Come Study With Me podcast is brought to you by the Why Religion family of podcasts at Brigham Young University Religious Education. We thank them for sponsoring this show. My name is Ellis Sondrup, a BYU student and your host. The Come Study With Me production team also includes BYU students Jeremy Richards, our audio and video editor, Lily Kreiser, our social media manager, and Taylor Davidson, our podcast manager. From BYU Religious Education, Professors Tyler Griffin and Anthony Sweat are faculty producers of the show. We invite you to come study with me on our next show as we explore Doctrine and Covenants Come Follow Me scripture.